Pulsar Studio.
Video games are the youngest artistic medium, and since their emergence, they have managed to create their own way of telling stories while taking inspiration and resources from other artistic media. This is Checkpoint, and today we are going to discover an example of how they do it. Genres in artistic media are a way of organizing and classifying work based on the resources, style, and tone used to tell or convey the story. In all artistic media, genres have common origins that have evolved and diversified over time. On video games, there is still a lot of ambiguity and confusion on how to choose or define genres. The main reason is due to its origin, since this artistic medium was born as a demonstration of the technical capacity of computers. Although the demonstration is to produce moving images from input orders encoded in zeros and ones, the images to be displayed are not chosen for a technical aspect, but for the creative influence of whoever writes or enters those orders. That being the case, it is inevitable that despite being a medium born in technology, it ends up using the same stories and ways of telling them that have been used throughout human evolution and are present in all artistic media. The number of genres in video games is wider and more varied than in other media. Some are defined by the main mechanics or actions, while others by the essential concept and emotion or sensation they use, and even some more are defined by the place and culture from which they originate. A game can be a shooter because the main action is to shoot. It can be a platformer because the main action is to move through platforms. But it also can be horror because its main resource is fear, or exploration because although the actions may be varied, the essence of the game is to explore and discover. What is ultimately rare and difficult is to take an structure, narrative, and genre from another artistic medium and use it almost textually as the basis for creating a video game. It is even more difficult to do it and achieve good results. However, this is what Remedy dared to do with Alan Wake. Alan Wake is a psychological thriller told in chapters or episodes which in their entirety make up the equivalent of one season of a television series. The game is about a writer who is going through a blackout period, and to get out of that situation, he and his wife decide to take vacation in a small fictional town of Washington. Shortly after arriving, inexplicable things begin to happen, leading to the disappearance of Alice, the protagonist's wife, and the manifestation of a shadow that represents the main threat. And you heard well, the verb can be to tell almost as much as it can be to play. This sounds like a recipe for failure or poor experience because an important suggestion on telling stories through video games is to avoid telling through text or narration, even cinematics, and rather tell as much as possible through mechanics and actions. However, as any creative process, by understanding and mastering the purpose of the functions, they can be modified, decomposed, and transformed in pursuit of the work and the vision. Remedy makes a great demonstration of this by telling the story through the voice of the protagonist himself, who narrates each event in past tense as if he was remembering and telling it to the player, while the player listens and leaves the story at his feet. However, the development of the game was not easy. The team at Remedy had a hard time sticking to the vision and not getting carried away or distracted by tempting features and elements that may sound good on their own or with other gameplay, but don't quite fit the experience they wanted to create and the story they wanted to tell. Even 3 years into development, the team had to stop and decide the way forward, putting aside everything that did not belong. Interestingly, most of the discarded elements were common video game ones, such as having an open world with choice, interaction with non-playable characters, and preparation cycles for action by collecting resources and building defense zones. The vision ended up heading towards the narrative structure as a television series. Being a psychological thriller, the main elements used are suspense, mystery, and confusion. the antagonist force in the story is the darkness, and in terms of mechanics, all darkness becomes a dead zone in which enemies are born in the form of human and animal shadows who attack and seek to kill Wake. The action takes place at night, where darkness completely covers the place and Alan is always vulnerable, having to fight his way through the shadows to find some refuge. Being an active enemy that seeks to end the protagonist, the oppression of darkness is always present, and this is not only experienced when narrated by the protagonist himself or through cinematics, but it is also present through actions within the gameplay. To create a compelling and robust experience by bringing together elements from two different artistic mediums and without losing sight of the genre and structure they envisioned, the developers focus on designing a simple but engaging gameplay that would follow the main theme of the story as a base. To survive, the player must take Alan to the few places where there is light, using also practical and mobile forms such as flashlights, these becoming the main tool to defend against enemies. By pointing light at the shadows, they become vulnerable and can be eliminated using a weapon. In that sense, the game adopts elements of action genre, but always using the light and darkness as the basis for the mechanics, promoting suspense and mystery. This is important because it is possible to tell the story without breaking the narrative when adapting it to the game. Both weapons and flashlights use ammunition, and these, following the narrative, are not recoverable by killing enemies, but are found in certain places such as cabins, police stations, emergency equipment, and they are not abundant. The action and combat are very simple, but sufficiently varied, having different sizes of flashlights with advantages and disadvantages, as well as 3 types of firearm, pistol, rifle and shotgun, also with their different advantages and disadvantages. This contributes to avoid generating the feeling in the player that each action is gridden and he has no decision even in the way in which he kills the enemies. The player must aim to shoot, but to help keep the experience focused and avoid throwing in mandatory elements like skill and dexterity, they added an aiming assist that makes the player feel skillful without needing to be. Mobility is simple but not limited. It is possible to flee from enemies instead of confronting them, but without reaching the point of breaking the balance of the game, putting obstacles in the way and areas where many enemies accumulate to not allow the player abuse to escape, generating that many times confronting and eliminating the shadows to be the optimal strategy. Facing enemies is a way of generating suspense and tension in the player, which would be lost if she could avoid it all the time. There is also a simple evasion mechanic that requires reaction at the right moment, pressing a button shortly before being hit to create an animation in which Alan dodges the attack and the enemy is exposed to be eliminated. This mechanic is planned to provide playability and engagement, because it requires a bit of skill to execute, but without being difficult to master, since the reaction window is wide, as well as the mechanic being optional, being another small element that contributes to enrich the gameplay, strengthening the playable part of the work without breaking the narrative or its format and structure. The purpose of the simple action-based gameplay is to represent the story through mechanics and create greater immersion in the player through interactivity. With the story and episodic structure clear, the developers could have made a game in the style of a graphical adventure, but if they did so, they would have missed the opportunity to enhance certain suspense and psychological elements that can be recreated through mechanics and actions of the player. When in a game, the narrative and story have a lot of weight, and it is not decided to go down the path of a graphic adventure, systems and mechanics are usually in the way of the experience, hindering it without wanting it or knowing it. In survival horror games with combat and action mechanics, rough and limited gameplay is often used as a resource to put the player in extreme, uncomfortable and scary situation. Complex level design or difficult enemy behaviors are also often created. This, far from generating terror and suspense, creates frustration. That the shooting or combat gameplay is uncomfortable and the enemies and levels difficult causes the player to die without being able to avoid it by practicing and improving their skill. And the action of dying does not create fear. On the contrary, Dying reminds that this is a game, and the illusion of belief and immersion are weakened because the player remembers that danger and risk are not so real. In Alan Wake, in addition to the combat and mobility mechanics already explained, a system was designed in which the game automatically adjusts the difficulty of the levels depending on the number of times the player dies and must try again, seeking that the player dies as few times as possible, but without reaching the point of creating an easy and boring experience. The combination of suspense, mystery, and the inevitable human need to know and understand what is happening is what hooks the player to the story and drives him to progress through the levels. Like a good psychological thriller, each step raises more questions than answers, and there are twists and turns, but that intrigue is also reflected in the gameplay, hiding secondary pieces of story, ammunition, weapons, flashlights, and even collectibles in areas outside the linear path that can only be discovered if the player dares to enter the darkness and explore. The situation in which Wake and the player are put is the graphic description of a nightmare, with notable inspiration in the works of Stephen King and David Lynch. The attack of darkness and shadows, the supernatural movement of objects, and the attack of animals like crows create the tension and paranoia that makes everyone and everything to be doubtful, even in the moments of tranquility in the light of the day. The player is led to doubt the protagonist himself, making her think that all or a large part of what is happening is product of the writer's imagination, who is finding fragments of a draft of a manuscript written by himself which describes the things that are happening but that he doesn't remember writing. In terms of character building, Alan Wake follows a progression similar to the hero's path, but giving it an imprint more similar to that used in film and television of the genre. The protagonist begins at his lowest point due to the confusion and guilt for the disappearance of Alice, with whom he has a discussion moments before being abducted, but instead of walking the path of the conventional hero in video games, in which he must get skills, tools, and overcome challenges that make him grow as a representation of this progress, it is the desperation and desire to get his wife back that leads him to fight from the start to finish against that nightmare and nothing more. The structure of the television series is tied with the rhythm and pacing of the game, in which each episode begins and ends with an important progress in the story and a new mystery, which is then developed with the actions of the game. Approximately every 1 or 2 hours of play, a point is reached where the player needs a break, and this is given by closing the chapter and giving the opportunity to continue at another time if they want to, as happens with TV series. Alan Wake is a successful and compelling proof of the value of borrowing resources and ideas from other artistic media. Some may not achieve a good result, but the attempt and exercise have helped the medium evolve and expand the opportunities. As artistic mediums and the very desire to tell stories, there are still many resources and elements shared with film and television that can be explored, and hopefully, video game creators will take advantage of that and continue experimenting that path. And you? What resources, structures, or genres of different artistic media would you like to see or have already seen in a video game? Leave it in the comments below. I hope you have enjoyed this episode of Checkpoint. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and share this to keep discovering the art in making and designing video games. See you next time!